Hello and welcome to another session of the Epistle to the Hebrews. I believe this is our third session. Our first session, we did just a lot of introductory points to what is the letter, who's the author, who are the intended readers, and what are some of the different ways that people have interpreted the book. And then we started off with the first four verses. It seems like it's going very slow, but the thing with Hebrews is that the arguments are very deep and there's a lot of details that are involved in it. It's not an easy read like First, Second, and Third John, but I think it's one of those books that if you take the time to appreciate what the author is doing, then number one, we won't ignore or overlook some of the points that he's making, and number two, I think we will draw greater significance from the effort that he has been inspired to put into this particular work. So, um, this particular session, we're going to be looking at where the author is going to be quoting from the Old Testament a lot. And what I typically find is that whenever a New Testament writer quotes from the Old Testament and somebody is preaching through this passage, they rarely go back to the Old Testament and read that passage, but not just that passage, but also the context in which that passage is. And so I wanted to take the time to do that today. So it's going to look like that we're not moving very far in Hebrews, but we're going to be covering a lot of ground because we're going to be understanding why it is the author is quoting this particular verse, how this particular verse actually adds to the argument, and we'll talk about some of the complexities with some of these quotations because there are some features that might not be readily apparent if you're just reading it in an English translation. So without further ado, let's just get started. Okay. Okay. I believe I'm full screen. If I'm not full screen, someone will say something to me in the chat. I'll
You're
put that
good.
right over. Looking good. Okay. All right. Excellent. So I gave a title to this section where we're going to go through verses 5 through 9. The Son in whom God has spoken is greater than the angels. I think that's the argument that he's trying to make. Now, that might be something that is pretty self evident to you. You might say, okay, yeah, the Son of God is greater than angels. That's pretty obvious. Okay, but why is the author making this argument? Why does it matter? Why does he feel that he has to make this argument? And why would it be relevant to not only the original readers, but also to all modern readers? Uh, those are some of the questions that I want to answer. And then, of course, ask the kind of so what questions. Why is this applicable for us today? Okay, so let's begin. So I think as a reminder, it's good for us to look at the big picture. And I think that in order that we do not lose sight of the larger argument as we wade through all the details, and there are a lot of details, it's a good idea to remember how the passage began and where the author is ending his argument. So we looked last time in the first four verses that God has definitively spoken through a highly exalted Son in the last days. And the author's made it clear that we are in the last days. Okay. I know a lot of people, they look at what's going on in the Middle East and they look over at Israel and everything else that's going on there and they think, are we in the last days? The last days began basically with the arrival of the Messiah, his resurrection, his ascension, and the gift of the Spirit. I think the New Testament writers make that abundantly clear. Okay, but the section we're going to be looking at today, or at least scratching the surface of it, is that Jesus is greater than the angels. Okay, but why does that matter? Well, where the argument is going to go, where the author is going to be taking all this, is he's going to say, therefore, because God has spoken definitively through a son, and the son is greater than the angels, it is all the more urgent to pay attention to what Jesus is saying and doing in the present being the last days. So there's heightened urgency. So that helps us, I believe. So we'll recall that the end of this argument is not saying anything negative about the angels, okay? Nor is the author correcting the audience about bad theology concerning the angels. He is simply using God's former positive use of angelic messengers to heighten the importance of the resurrected and exalted Son, Jesus Christ. Okay. Why am I making this point? Well, some people have said, well, the author of Hebrews is saying that Jesus is greater than the angels, maybe because the readers uh, were maybe they were worshiping the angels, and the author's trying to say, well, no, you need to actually worship the Son instead. But you don't get the impression when you read through this section that there's anything bad being said about the angels or that there's any sort of corrective tone. Also, it wouldn't make sense that if you are writing a letter to somebody that you start correcting them in like the fifth verse. Like that's just not a good way to like have a conversation with somebody, especially with someone that you know. You don't immediately jump in to corrective mode. You talk about things you already agree on. Okay. So the contrast with Jesus and the angels is not to say angels are bad, Jesus is good. It's to say God has formerly worked through the angels in the Old Testament. God is now working through the Son, who's greater than the angels. So if you listen to angels in the past, you better all the more listen to the Son right now in the present. I think that's what the author is trying to do. And you can decide for yourself if you think that is a persuasive reading. Okay, so in the section we're going to be looking at, there's going to be a lot of quoting from the Old Testament. Some of it's from the Greek version of the Old Testament. Some of it is from passages that you'll be able to see in your English translation. But it's often difficult to see how this is working because there are a lot of quotations. Some of them are quotations that don't appear anywhere else in the New Testament. Like this is the only time the New Testament is quoting this passage, so it's an unfamiliar passage. And sometimes it's difficult to keep track of what the author is actually doing. So I thought, again, let's just kind of look at the big picture, what is actually taking place. So this is verses 5 through 14, which is basically the rest of chapter 1. So I got two columns. God working through angels and God working through the Son. Okay. So in parentheses, that's the verse in Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 5. Okay. So in chapter 1, verse 5, he's going to say, to which of the angels has God ever said? And then there's a quotation from Psalm 2:7 and 2 Samuel 7:14. Okay. So that's in verse 5. All right. And then he's going to use in chapter 1, verse 6, a quotation from Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. The difficulty, though, is that if you look this verse up in your Old Testament, it's not going to look the way that he's quoting it. There's a reason for that. We're going to have to talk about that, okay? But that passage says that all the angels of God should worship the Son, okay? Well, if the angels are worshiping the Son, then obviously the Son is greater than the angels, and the Son is important, okay? Then he moves back, chapter 1, verse 7, and he says, God has made the angels spirits and flames of fire. There's a reason for that. And then he's going to, in chapter 1, verse 8, talk about the Son with a quotation from Psalm 45, verse 6. And then he's going to continue in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9 with another quote from Psalm 45, the very next verse, Psalm 45, verse 7. Okay. He's going to give another quotation of the Son that is actually 3 verses long, verses 10, 11, and 12, which is Psalm 102, verse 25, Psalm 102, verse 26, and Psalm 102, verse 27. Okay. The reason why he's going to quote these long passages is because they contrast with what was said about the angels in chapter 1, verse 7. Then at the very end, he's going to do another quotation. He's going to say, to which of the angels did he ever say? And then a quote from Psalm 110, verse 1. And then he's going to conclude all of this with a rhetorical question, which would obviously imply something about the angels that I think the readers already know. Okay. So again, it's when you're reading through Hebrews chapter 1, you'll see a lot of quotations, but most people don't know where they're from. Some of them are difficult to look up, and it's often difficult to see what the author is trying to do. So again, he's not saying anything negative about the angels. He's just trying to show how the angels functioned and how the Son is functioning in a much better role in order to heighten the current relevance of the Son in whom God is currently speaking to the churches. Okay, so we need to go through and we need to look at all of these verses and ask the question, why is the author quoting it? Why does this matter? And how does the quotation serve the purposes of his argument? We'll just do this one bite at a time. This is how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Okay, so Psalm 2:7 is quoted in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5. This is the first of two quotations in this particular verse. Okay, so this is what Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 says. Okay, for to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I begotten you"? Or again, and then there's the second quotation, which we'll look at on the next slide. But I highlighted or bolded the part from Psalm 2:7. Okay, so the opening question is surely rhetorical. When he's saying, "To which of the angels did God ever say?" You're obviously supposed to answer that by saying, "To no angel." Okay, because these are all things that are said about human Israelite kings. So they're not talking about heavenly angels, these celestial angelic beings. So, if these exalted things are being said about these human figures, then obviously they're not being said about the angels. So you should obviously know that the rhetorical answer to that is no, to no angels. Okay. All right. So he's quoting from Psalm 2. What is Psalm 2? Psalm 2 is called a royal enthronement psalm. Okay. In this psalm, the human king is anointed by Yahweh and the king is installed in his royal role. Okay. Now, some people think that Psalm 2 is predictive prophecy. Okay. But Psalms typically don't function that way. Okay. They typically are not, they're just songs that would be sung at the enthronement of a king, or as we're going to look a little bit later in Psalm 45 at a king's wedding. But songs are typically not prophetic. Okay. The New Testament authors probably didn't read them as prophetic prophecy. They probably read them typologically. They would probably see Jesus as kind of the antitype to where the human Israelite kings were the prototypes. Okay. So they do have relevance to the New Testament, but probably in the sense of typology, not in the sense of predictive prophecy. Psalms, again, it's just not normal to take Psalms as predictive prophecy. So that's the connection there. All right. So let's look a little bit at Psalm 2. Okay. Why would the author of Hebrews want to say about Jesus something from Psalm 2? Let's get the context. Let's not just look at the quote. Let's look at the context here. Okay. And I'm even going to use my little pen. What color am I going to use? Let's use blue. Oh, we can see this. Okay, so starting in Psalm 2, verse 1, why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh, okay, and another person, and against his anointed, okay. The word for anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. When it gets translated into the Greek, it is Christos, Christ. Okay. So we have Yahweh and we have his anointed. Okay. Yahweh is the one who anoints. The king is the anointed one. That much is obvious. It's clear. And obviously the pronoun here, his, indicates that Yahweh is only one person, one male person. Okay. So then that's verses 1 through 2. In verse 6, it picks up right here. And here, the person speaking is the psalmist, the person writing the psalm, okay, who is the king. And he says, as for me, excuse me. This is God talking. Okay. As for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. You can see there. Okay. The king that God has installed, okay, is on Zion. Okay. Zion is the poetic way of describing Jerusalem. Okay. So it's Jerusalem. It's Mount Zion in the Psalms. Okay. All right. So notice that the king is just another way of talking about God's anointed. We already knew that. We already know that the anointed king, the Mashiach, and the Christ is the king. And whose king is it? It's God's king. Okay. All right. So that's a quotation from God. Verse 7, I will surely tell the decree of Yahweh. So this is, of course, the psalmist talking about Yahweh. He, Yahweh, said to me, the king, he said to me, you are my son. Okay. Today I have begotten you. What that means is today I have become your father. Today I become your father. Well, what does he mean by becoming the father? Well, in the previous verse, and this is really important, in Psalm 2:6, God has installed his king on Zion. God has established the king. He said, okay, I'm installing you. I'm setting you up for your role. You are now the king. Okay. And how did this happen? God said, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Okay. This is not beginning in the sense of a father creating a child or the father having a child. It's the installation of the king. And the installation of the king is the king receiving the title Son of God. Okay. You can see right here, my son obviously is a title Son of God. Okay. Who is God? God obviously is Yahweh. Who is the Son? The Son is, verse 2, the anointed, the Mashiach, the Christ. Verse 6, God's King. Verse 7, God's Son. All of those are synonymous titles. And by the time you get to the New Testament, the writers assume you know that. The writers assume, based on your familiarity with Psalm 2, that you know that Messiah, Christ, King of the Jews, and Son of God are all synonymous titles. Most people don't know that, but this was common knowledge based on Psalm 2. Okay. And then notice here in verse 8 what God says to the king. Ask of me, the Father. Okay. Notice, by the way, that if you are my son, then Yahweh has to be the Father. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance, the very ends of the earth as your possession. Okay. So Psalm 2, verse 7 is quoted, as you can see here. All right. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. I hope that all these lines are not going to distract you. Okay. All right. The point there is that this is not a declaration of the birth of Jesus. It's a declaration of Jesus being installed in his role as the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, as God's king, and as the Son of God. Okay? All right? That's really important. Okay? So we can ask the question here. Okay? How does this fit into the argument? Well, Christ is greater than the angels, based just on Psalm 2:7, because he has been installed as God's messianic king, and he has given, or he has been given, the inheritance of the entire earth. Okay. That's a pretty good reason why the Son is greater than the angels. Okay. The angels have not been installed as the anointed royal king, and the angels have not been given the very ends of the earth as their possession. Okay. That's a pretty self-evident reason why the Son is greater than the angels. Okay. Let's erase all the ink. All right. So that's Psalm 2:7. Okay. But the rest of Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 has another quotation there. Of course, I will be his father and he will be my son. Okay. So again, the same rhetorical question is asked. To which of the angels did God ever say, I will be his father and he will be my son? All right. Again, notice there that God is saying himself, I am the father and he's going to be the son. That much is clear. So 2 Samuel 7 is from the Davidic covenant. Okay. The Davidic covenant is the covenant, the agreement, the pact, where Yahweh promises to provide King David with a house, namely a dynasty, but Solomon actually built an actual house, the temple. But what he's promised is a dynasty, a house, a throne, and a kingdom forever. Okay. Now, since God has raised Jesus from the dead, Jesus is equipped to fulfill this never-ending rule. Okay. Because Jesus, let me get my pen again. Okay. If David's dynasty, all right, if his dynasty is a line of descendants that are going to rule on his throne and rule over his kingdom forever, then if Jesus is going to be the last one, he has to have immortality. He has to be able to live forever in order to rule on the throne forever, in order to have a kingdom forever. Okay? So the only way that Jesus fulfills this is by God raising him from the dead and giving him immortality. Okay. Notice Jesus could not have this innately because he was born as a human being. He was mortal. He was not going to live forever. He's only able to live forever if God gives you never-ending life. Okay. I know that's I'm preaching on the choir here, but for a lot of people, they don't understand this. They don't understand how this works. And earlier in the argument in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, the author has already indicated that God has raised Jesus from the dead and exalted him and seated him at God's right hand. Okay, so that much has already been established for the readers. All right. So why does he quote 2 Samuel 7? Well, let's look at the context. Remember, he's quoted verse 14, but we need to get the context here. All right. So how is this working? This is Yahweh speaking through the prophet Nathan to King David about David's descendants. Okay, do you got that? Let's make sure we're clear on that. Yahweh speaking through the prophet Nathan to King David about David's descendants. Okay, we got to make sure we're all clear here. Okay, so it's Nathan speaking, but it's God speaking through Nathan to David. When your days are complete, you, David, and you lie down with your fathers, notice that when David dies, he's going to lie down in the grave with his ancestors. Okay, who's that? That's Yahweh. I will raise up your descendant after you. Okay, and where is he going to come from? Is he going to come from heaven? No, he's going to come forth from you. He's going to be one of your own descendants. He's going to come from your own loins. He's going to be a lineal, biological descendant of David, which means he's going to be a human being. And I, Yahweh, I'm going to establish this kingdom. He's going to build a house for my name. Okay, whether that means houses in a temple or houses in a dynasty, there's kind of a double meaning there. Okay, and I, Yahweh, I'm going to establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then you get the quote from verse 14 that is used here in Hebrews 1:5. I will be a father to him. He will be a son to me. Okay. Now you remember earlier, right here, in the quotation of Psalm 2:7, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Okay. The installation of the king means to give him the title Son of God. Notice here, the installation of the king, the Davidic king, to whom is promised a throne in the kingdom forever, means that he's going to have the title as in a son to me. Who is the me? The me is a father. Okay? Notice again, in all these passages, Yahweh is the Father alone. He's only one person. This is not a triune God. I know we all know this. Okay? But he's saying here, I, single person, first person singular. Who am I? I am the Father. I'm going to be a father to him. He's going to be a son to me. He's going to have that title. Okay? So the son of David, notice here, he's the son of David. He's also the son of God. Son of David and son of God. Okay? He's a son of David because he's a lineal biological descendant of David. And he's God's son because God is his father and he bears the title Son of God in his role as the king. Okay. And then in verse 16, he reiterates the three promises, your house, your kingdom being forever, and your throne will be established forever. Okay. So both of these quotations, 2 Samuel 7:14, Psalm 2:7, indicate that Jesus is the Son of God, meaning he is the anointed king, the descendant of David, okay, the heir of the Davidic promises, the heir of David's throne, and the heir of David's kingdom, and also someone that's going to rule in this kingdom and rule in that throne forever in light of the fact that he's been raised from the dead. Well, who raised him from the dead? Answer, clearly Yahweh did. All right, so how does this fit into the argument? How does this help the author of Hebrews convey to the readers that Christ is greater than the angels? Christ is greater than the angels because he's the promised heir of David's kingdom over which he will rule as an immortalized king. That's a pretty big deal. Okay, the angels are not promised to rule in David's kingdom. In fact, Paul says, if you're taking notes, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 3, he says, don't you know that we're going to be judging angels? Like he says this as if it's like common knowledge. You should know this. Don't you know that human beings are going to be exalted? You know, they're going to have all things put under their feet, which seems to include angels as well. We're going to be judging angels. Okay. Human beings are the crowning accomplishment of God's creation, not angels. Let's erase what we got here. All right. So you can see there's a lot of details that go into these quotations that if you're just, kind of casually or even devotionally reading through the New Testament, you're going to miss these things because we rarely go back in the Old Testament and read the things in the context and ask these deep questions. All right, chapter 1, verse 6. This is a quotation from Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. Okay, so this is what Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6 says. It says, and again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all of God's angels worship him. Okay? Now, if you're following along in your translation, okay, this word again, all right, might actually show up right here, okay, because there's a little bit of ambiguity. So some translations will say, and again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, and other translations will say, and when he again brings the firstborn into the world, okay? So which one is right and which one is wrong? Well, it's not that one is translated incorrectly. It's ambiguous. It's just we have to talk about this. So there's some ambiguity over this adverb again. Okay, is it introducing a new quotation, like we saw in chapter 1, verse 5? You saw in chapter 1, verse 5, it says, to which of the angels did he ever say, "You're my son, today I've begotten you"? And again, I said, I'm going to introduce to you another quotation, and then he quotes 2 Samuel 7:14. So here he has, and again. So to me, I actually think that it actually is functioning in a way to introduce a new quotation. That's what Dustin thinks. Okay, like it does in chapter 1, verse 5. Okay, some translations, I think the NASB does this, uses again, and it puts it right here to modify the verb bring, to modify the act of bringing, okay? As in, when he, namely God, again brings the firstborn into the world. As in, God's already done it once, he's going to do it again, okay? I don't think that works for a couple of reasons, but we'll talk about that. So this is why you might look in translations and you might see that this word again is put in different places because it means different things. Okay. But it's not a mistranslation. It's just a matter of how you think it's functioning. So again, I think the best way to read it is that it's introducing a new quotation, which is the way that the phrase "and again" was used literally in the previous verse, chapter 1, verse 5. Okay. And also using it to say that God has again, as in for a second time, brought the firstborn to the world. That is actually not going to make sense with this quotation. So you'll see why here in a second. Okay. All right. Let me erase that because I'm trying to not clutter my screen here. I'm trying to use these tools without making it super cluttery. All right. So he's going to bring the firstborn into the world. What does firstborn mean? What is firstborn? Okay. All right. So firstborn is a title that has been given to the Davidic king. Now, it could mean a lot of things, okay? But the context here is that we've seen quotation about the Davidic king and another quotation about the Davidic king, okay? So, seeing a title that's used for the Davidic king seems to be a very natural way of reading this, okay? A firstborn could also mean the very first thing created in history, okay? I don't think that fits the context here. I think the title being the Davidic king. And that, of course, shows up in Psalm 89, which is a psalm about the Davidic covenant, which is all about what we just read in 2 Samuel 7:14 and Psalm 2:7. So all of Psalm 89, which is long and massive, is all about the Davidic covenant and God's faithfulness to it. Okay. So again, we're asking the question, why does he describe Jesus as firstborn? Why is he doing that? That's the purpose of this. Okay. So Psalm 89, he, the king, will cry out to me, Yahweh, you are my father, my God. Notice here that God is just the Father alone, the rock of my salvation. And then God says, I'm going to make him my firstborn. And what does firstborn mean as the passage continues? The highest of the kings of all the earth. Okay. So firstborn doesn't mean first in time, firstborn in time. It means first in rank. And firstborn is very similar to being called Son of God. Son of God is a title in relation to God, namely the Father. And here you have a title, firstborn. Obviously, it's related to Son of God, and it has to do with the role of the king. And of course, the Messiah is the greatest king. He's the greatest king, the highest of the kings of all the earth. Okay. So I think that in light of the context of everything going on with the Davidic covenant and all the Davidic quotations, that the reference here in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6, the firstborn, is in relation to the highest of the kings of the earth. Okay? Not Jesus being the firstborn and created thing of all time. Okay? The word can mean that. I just don't think that's what it means here in the context. Okay. So we've addressed the word again. We've addressed the word firstborn. Okay. But let's try to figure out what's going on here. What is the quotation? Let all God's angels worship him. Okay. So here's the thing. If you were to go in your Bible right now, and you could do this, okay, go look in Deuteronomy 32:43. That's not what the quotation is going to say. And you're like, well, Dustin, you're telling me it's from Deuteronomy 32:43, but I'm looking in my Bible. It's not there. What's going on? Are you lying to me? No, I'm not lying to you. Okay. Because remember, the author of Hebrews is not working from the Hebrew text. The author of Hebrews is working from the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation performed by Jewish people of the Hebrew text. And so sometimes the Hebrew text is a little bit different. So let me show you how it works. Okay. The Hebrew text says this. It says, rejoice, O heavens, with him, and let all the sons of God worship him. Okay. Sons of God is being understood as angels. Okay. Sons of God being as angels. Okay. That's a plural there. Okay. All right. So we have rejoicing and the summons for the angelic sons of God to worship somebody. Worship somebody. Okay. But in the Hebrew text, this is what it says. The Hebrew text says this. Rejoice, O nations. And then it literally just says his people. The NASB has to put the word with in italics to try to make sense of rejoice, O nations, his people. Like they want to put that in there. So that's not actually in the text. Okay. So here's one of the interesting questions. Okay. How in the world, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. Like, first of all, like how did all this get added? That's an interesting question. Okay. I don't have an answer to that. It just, they put it on. It seems that probably what took place is that rejoicing, O heavens, was further interpreted as those who are in the heavens. Who are those that are in the heavens? The angelic sons of God. And if they're rejoicing with him, then the angelic sons of God are rejoicing by offering worship to him. That's probably what's going on, at least in the eyes of the translator. But the other issue is that we have his people in the Hebrew, and we have with him in the Greek. And you're like, what in the world is going on here? Okay. All right. So here's one of the things. You have to know some Hebrew in order to make sense of this. Okay. The Hebrew phrase, which is unpointed. Okay. The unpointed and the vowels, it could mean with him, which in Hebrew would be emo. Okay. Or it could be his people, which is amo. All right. So the NASB has read the Hebrew as his people. Okay. But those consonants could also mean with him, as the translator of the Septuagint understood it. You could see with him. Okay. I know this is complicated, and I'm really sorry, but I'm apologizing for the complexity with the languages that are creating what seems to be a quotation in the New Testament that doesn't line up with what we have in the Old Testament. I'm trying to explain as best I can about these points. Okay. So again, the unpointed Hebrew is ambiguous. It could mean with him, as the Jews who translated it into Greek understood it, or it could mean his people, as the NASB has translated it. I think the New Revised Standard also does the same thing. Okay. That's a pretty big difference there. But the whole point is, like, how do you know? How do you know what the Hebrew originally meant? It's ambiguous. Okay. All right. So let me erase all that because we're already getting a little complicated here. All right. The point, though, is that the translator of the Greek has taken this phrase, rejoice, O heavens, with him, and they've doubled it into a further definition of what that means. Rejoicing, O heavens, means worship him, all of you who are in the heavens, namely the sons of God, the angelic sons of God. Okay? And the location in heaven is very interesting. The location in heaven is very interesting. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that's going to come up a little bit later. Okay? All right. So the author of Hebrews is saying, let all of the angels of God worship him, namely worship Jesus. Okay? All right. But here's the interesting thing, is that the text in Deuteronomy 32, okay, the hymn is actually a reference there to the Father. So we have a passage that was formerly used to the Father now being applied to the Son. Now being applied to the Son. And I think that he can do this. I think he can do this because we already read in Psalm 2 that the Son is given everything as his inheritance. He receives everything that belongs to God. Okay. And I think earlier in Hebrews chapter 1, I think verse 4 or verse 3, the writer has said that God has made the Son, or I think it's verse 2 actually, the heir of all things. Okay? So everything that belongs to the Father has now been given to the Son. So worship that is due to the Father can now be given to the Son, but you're not confusing the Father and the Son. Clearly they're distinct. Clearly they're distinguished there. Okay, but I think that's what's going on. We have a Father text in Deuteronomy now being applied to the Son in Deuteronomy. Okay. The answer for that is not that the Father is the Son, but that the Son is the heir of all things that the Father has given to him in light of his post-resurrection exaltation. Okay, now, we've forgotten one other point. Into the world. Okay, this word for world only occurs twice in Hebrews. Okay, it's not the word cosmos, which means like the world, the land, the third rock from the sun. Okay, all right. The only other time that it's used in Hebrews is in chapter 2, verse 5. Okay, where he tells you that we're talking about the coming world about which we are speaking, and God did not subject this to the angels. Okay. Now, in the book of Hebrews, you have to kind of keep this in your mind. In the book of Hebrews, the author says that we are seeking the heavenly city. We are seeking the city that is above. Okay? And we know that when you think of the heavenly city, it's not the city that you die and you go to. It's the city that comes out of heaven from God. It's the kingdom, it's God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. It's God's kingdom that's going to come down to earth. Okay? So, here's how we solve all of this. Here's how we solve, because this verse is actually really complex. Let me erase. Here's how I think is going on here. All right. God brings the firstborn into the world. Okay. What if the world that he's referring to, okay, is the world to come, the coming world right here, okay, that is currently being established in heaven, but it's going to descend from heaven down to earth at the second coming? What if Jesus, who is sitting at God's right hand, and he's functioning as a ruler in some capacity, which indicates that his rule is already going on, the rule that's never going to end. He's ruling as a king. If he's already functioning as a ruler in some capacity, and that the readers of Hebrews are seeking the city that is above, the city that's going to come down out of heaven at the second coming, what if when God brings the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth, into the world, it means when God exalts Jesus to heaven, as in when that took place at the exaltation? What if that's what it means? Okay. Then he's saying, let all of God's angels worship him, which would indicate that God's angels, who are currently in the presence of Jesus, they're right there with them right now. They are currently worshiping him right now. Okay. That would indicate that, of course, Jesus is greater than the angels. Why is Jesus greater than the angels? Because the angels are currently worshiping him in fulfillment of Scripture. Okay. I know it's complex. I get it. But I'm just, I'm apologizing for this author because there's just a lot of complexity that's going on here. Okay. And I'm aware that we're like literally every one of these words could be interpreted in a different way. I understand that. I get it. Okay. But we have in Hebrews 1:5, we have the enthronement of the Son. Today I become your father. I have installed my king on Zion. We have 2 Samuel 7:14, where I'm going to be his father. He's going to be my son. He's going to have the throne and the kingdom forever. Okay. And again, we have another, what seems to be a promise of enthronement, to where God brings the highest of the kings into this world, namely the world to come, that he's going to bring at his second coming. And the angels who are already there in his presence are worshiping him. Okay. All right. I'm not saying that the coming world is heaven. I'm not saying that. I don't think that's what the author of Hebrews is saying. It's not saying that the coming world or the coming kingdom is heaven, a place you need to go, because it comes out of heaven. It's the city that is above that's going to descend from heaven. Okay. It's the heavenly city, meaning the city that's going to come out of heaven and has its origins with God. And Jesus is already functioning in some sense as the king because he's enthroned at God's right hand. I think that's what's going on there. Okay. But I understand people have different ways of reading it, but I'm trying to follow very carefully as best I can the argument of the author. Again, this word for world in Hebrews only appears twice. Okay. And the only other time here is in chapter 2, verse 5. And he said, we're talking about the coming world. Okay. The age to come. All right. So again, how does Deuteronomy 32:43 only in the Greek version, not in the Hebrew version? How does that help not Paul's argument, the author of Hebrews? How does it help his argument? Christ is greater than the angels because they worship him as the Messiah already right now. Already right now. Again, that's pretty obvious. All right. That was a lot. I get it. Okay. This is why we're going slow, because these details matter. Okay. Chapter 1, verse 7. Now, this is a quote from Psalm 104, verse 3. It's a little bit easier here. Okay. All right. But of the angels, he says, okay, he, I think, is a reference to God. He says, who makes, or it's like this is like the one who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. Okay. So now he's talking about the angels. What are the angels? Well, God makes them winds and flames of fire. Okay. All right. So angels, angels, just another word for messengers. Okay. So they are paralleled. Notice his angels are paralleled with his ministers. Okay. And what do? Well, how do they function? Well, they're God's servants. Okay. They're his ministers. They're his messengers. And they're also flexible in their roles. God can make his angels serve as wind somehow. Okay. And also as flames of fire. They can do things with the wind. They can hold the wind back. They can create fire. They can come with fire. They can travel with fire. They're flexible. They could do a lot of different things. Okay. So I think there's two things that are being said here about angels. Okay. First of all, they're servants / ministers, and they're flexible in their roles. I think that's what the author is doing. He's trying to say, here's something about the angels, because he's going to contrast this with the Son in the next verse. But before we do that, let's just kind of make sure we understand what's going on here. Okay. All right. But here's the thing. Again, you can go back and you can look in the Old Testament and you'll say the wording is not exactly the same. The wording is not exactly the same. Okay. So if you have the NASB, it's going to say he makes the winds his messengers, flaming fire his ministers. So wait a minute. Who is the subject of the making? Okay. In the quotation, we have God makes his angels. Okay. Well, sorry, God is the subject. The question is, who's the object? Who's the direct object? The angels are the direct object. And then what does he make them? He makes them into winds. Okay. But if you go and you read the Old Testament, it looks like he makes object of his making the winds into his messengers. Well, which one is it? Does it matter? Why is it different in the quotation in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 7 when you compare it with the Old Testament? Well, the reason for that is because in the Hebrew text, it doesn't actually identify the subject or the object with the verb. It just gives a verb, and then it gives you the noun and the noun. And you don't, like, normally when we put those sentences together, we have like a subject, we have a verb, I'm doing something, and then we have a direct object, okay? But in this particular Hebrew text, Psalm 104, verse 3, it doesn't indicate to you who the subject is, or sorry, the object. The subject clearly is God. God is the subject. It doesn't indicate to you the object of the verb or the indirect object. So it could be ambiguous. but it's not a mistranslation. That's the thing. You got differences here. It's not a mistranslation. All right. Clearly, messenger is just another way of referring to angels. We see that. Okay. The Septuagint just says, "Who makes the angels wins?" They had to make a decision. The Greek translators had to make a decision. So you have that there. All right. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter, this role of the angels? Why does it matter for the argument of Hebrews? The author of Hebrews is later, and by later I mean very, very soon. He's going to return to this point when he reiterates the servant role in which the angels serve. Okay. So at the end of the chapter, the last thing that he says, this is the final rhetorical question. That's not a quotation from the Old Testament. The author says, "Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?" Okay, who are those that are going to inherit salvation? Answer: the faithful people of God. Okay, how do these ministering spirits, namely the angels, how do they function? Well, they're ministers, and what do? They render servants. They render service. Okay, they're ministers and they're servants. That's what they do. Okay, all right, that's their function. Okay, they have a serving capacity. They have a ministering capacity. All right, they are ministers. They are servants. We see that. Okay, this is really, really important because the next quotation is not going to make much sense to you if you don't see how it's being contrasted with the angels who have a ministering and serving function and have a flexible role. Okay, again, why does this matter? Christ is greater than the angels because they are servants and ministers, often with changing roles, in contrast to his, namely Jesus' perpetual role as the anointed king of God's kingdom. I mean, the promise is that Christ is going to rule forever, forever and ever. Okay? And he's going to rule as a king. So who is greater, a minister and a servant or a king? Obviously, the answer is a king. Okay? All right. What also is a difference? Someone whose role changes constantly, they're angels, they're winds, they're flames of fire, or a king that is going to be ruling as a king forever. Okay? Obviously, those are some big differences. Okay? So again, you can only make sense of these quotations if you see how they're being contrasted. All right. Now we get to chapter 1, verse 8. All right. We're already 45 minutes into it. My goodness. There's a lot of content here, a lot of detail. Okay. So chapter 1, verse 8, controversial passage. It says, "But of the Son, not of angels, but of the Son, he, God says, 'Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom.'" You'll recall that the next verse, chapter 1, verse 9, is going to continue this quotation from Psalm 45. Okay. All right. So the contrast is with the permanency, namely we have changing roles versus the enduring role of the Son, and with the role in itself, okay, servant's role or the promised Davidic king, the Son of God. Okay, that's the contrast. The contrast in the permanency and in the role. Okay, the angels are servants that change. The Son is a king who is going to rule forever. That's the contrast. That's the contrast. All right. So again, notice the ongoing theme of enthronement. Okay. We saw the theme of enthronement with two quotations in chapter 1, verse 5, with arguably another quotation in chapter 1, verse 6, and here with another quotation in chapter 1, verse 8. It's the enthronement of the Son. It's God installing his king, God installing the Messiah. Enthronement, enthronement, enthronement. Okay. It seems so clear to me. It just jumps off the page once we set these quotations in their original context. All right. All right. Now, Psalm 45 is a royal wedding psalm. And Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8 is quoting it. And the royal wedding psalm is originally, it's probably the most important thing I'm going to say all day. It is a wedding song that was formerly about Solomon or Hezekiah. It was not formally about Jesus. How do we know this? You can go back and read the psalm, and it's clearly about a king, a Davidic king, who's getting married to a real woman. Okay? This is not Christ getting married to the church. Okay, this is a king getting married to a woman, which is why most people think it refers to Solomon, but it could also refer to Hezekiah. So again, we can't just read Psalm 45 verse 6. You got to read the context. So I got an entire slide. We're going to do that, and we can't look at all of it. Can't look at the entirety of the Psalms. I just figured let's read 5 verses before and a few verses after to kind of get this point. All right. Let's talk a little bit about this. Okay, so first of all, it is a love song. Okay, all right. 45 verse 1. My heart overflows with a goodly theme. I address my verses to the king. Okay, notice this is a psalm that is not sung to Yahweh. This is a psalm that is sung to a human being. It was possible to sing praises to the human king. The very first verse tells you that. It's a love song to the human king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You, the king, you're the most handsome of all men. Grace is poured from your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Okay, clearly God is someone distinguished from the king. God is the one that has blessed this king. Okay, gird up your sword on your thigh, O mighty one. Notice he's not just a handsome guy who is a good speaker and someone who's been blessed by God. He's someone who is a powerful warrior. Okay, he has glory and he has majesty. Now, if you know these terms, glory and majesty, those are attributes of God. Those are things that belong to God. But now they're being described as the king. Does that mean that the king is God? No. Notice, God has blessed this king forever, which means God has empowered and authorized this king. So God has shared his own glory and majesty with this king. All right. In your majesty, ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and defend the right. Let your right hand teach you dread deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The people fall under you. Okay. All right. And then it talks about his rule. This is the quotation that Hebrews is going to be using. Your throne, O God, endures forever and ever. Your righteous scepter is the scepter of equity. And then in chapter 1, verse 9 of Hebrews, it's going to quote this next part. You love righteousness and you hate wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. All right. That's the part that the author of Hebrews is interested in, is that part. All of that. All of that. Okay, let's go on. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. That's not Jesus. Okay. From ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. Again, we're talking about like Solomon. Come on. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. This is a wedding psalm. This is what's happening at a wedding. We've got the ladies of honor. Okay. Daughters of kings have been invited to this wedding. Okay. I mean, obviously the king's getting married. He's going to invite lots of other kings to as his wedding party. Okay. At your right hand stands the queen. And she's wearing the gold of Ophir. This is a woman that he's getting married to. This is not Jesus. Obviously. It's so obvious. Just read the context, okay? There's so many people that they jump to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, and they tell me all the time, God calls the Son God. He must be God. He is called God, but he's called God in the sense that the human Davidic king in Psalm 45 was called God, which is God in the sense that he is an agent of God's rule and reign. But the original king in Psalm 45 was a human being. He was a man. He was a member of the human race. He was the Israelite king, and he is empowered by God. God has blessed him forever. God has shared his glory and his majesty with this king. God has shared his own title with this king. God is the one who has anointed this king, which means that the king is the Messiah, the Christ. And he's anointed him beyond your companions, as in like he's exalted him above his fellow brothers. Okay? I take all of this as obvious and self-evident. You just got to go back and read it. It's there in the text. It's obvious. It's clear to see. All right. So let's go back to the previous slide. Psalm 45 is drawing on the royal wedding psalm formerly about Solomon or Hezekiah. They are human kings. They are human Israelite kings. They are human kings that are also in the line of the Davidic covenant. So naturally, Jesus, who has been raised from the dead, And the ultimate heir of the Davidic covenant would be the ultimate person to whom Psalm 45 could be attributed. So the human Israelite king is called God, very specifically, in his role as the true God's royal agent. He is the one who rules on behalf of the true God. Okay? He, God, says of the Son, he calls him God, not because he's the one true God, but because God is a noun, it's a title. God's name is not God, God's name is Yahweh. So God is the title that the true God can share with his agents. Okay? The king is called God here and in Isaiah 9:6. The judges are called God in Exodus 21 and Exodus 22. Okay? And the prophets are called God in Exodus chapter 4 and Exodus chapter 7. This is a normal way in which God authorizes his agents. Okay? Yes, it's true. Jesus is called God in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. It is not true that he is called God in the same way that the true God is God. He's called God as an agent because he's quoting a passage from Psalm 45 in which that king was called God. No one thinks that Solomon is Yahweh. No one thinks that Hezekiah is Yahweh. They were called God as God's agents, as God's human agents. Okay, now, having been raised from the dead and given immortality, Christ's rule will be forever and ever. Okay, so obviously the fact that his throne, his rule is forever and ever is due to the fact that Christ has been raised from the dead. By whom? By God. All right. In other words, the never-ending rule of Christ is due to God's gift of eternal life. Okay. So Jesus can't rule forever on his own. He doesn't innately have that ability. He only has that because God raised him from the dead, God highly exalted him, and God has enthroned him. He's enthroned at God's right hand, but he's going to be enthroned at the second coming in the throne of David. Okay? Everything that Jesus has is because God gives it to him. Okay, so how does verse 8 function in this argument? Christ is greater than the angels because his post-resurrection rule as the Davidic Messiah will endure forever. Okay? He's a Davidic Messiah. He's not a servant or a minister. He's going to rule forever. He's not changing or fluctuating in his role. Okay? That's why he's better. All right, last verse we'll look at. All right, this is verse 9, okay, which is just a continuation of Psalm 45, which you already read, okay, where it says, you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness, okay, you, the Son. Therefore, O God, this is another place to where the king is called God. And he says, your God has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Okay. Now, here's what's interesting in this. All right. Notice, you have done these things, therefore God has anointed you above your companions. There's a purpose statement there. This therefore, that gets overlooked a lot. Therefore, okay. You did these things, therefore God did something for you. Okay. Therefore, draws attention to how God anointed and exalted Christ. Notice, he anointed him. Okay. And he is beyond his companions or above his companions. Why? What did he do? Because he loved righteousness and hated wickedness. It's because of his virtuous deeds. So when did this happen? Answer, it's in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus lived a faithful life. He obeyed God. He loved God. He loved his neighbor. And he died on the cross. And so God raised him from the dead and exalted him to heaven. He exalted Jesus far above all of his companions because Jesus demonstrated his virtue. He loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Okay. Notice Jesus owes his position to God. God is the one who has given this to him. And again, notice that the true God is called your God. Whatever you want to call Jesus, he has a God above him. He has a God who's anointed him. He has a God who's empowered him. He has a God that's exalted him to heaven. And he has a God who has given him eternal life. How you can confuse the two, I don't know how. You're just not looking at the details. It's so obvious. It's right there on the text. All right. So the human king, back in Psalm 45, let's just call him Solomon, okay, who's bearing the title God, has a God above him, your God, the one who has anointed you, okay? Two different uses for God. We have God as a title that's given to the king in verse 8 and at the beginning of verse 9. That's this reference right here, okay? All right. But he is not the God who anointed him. That is, of course, this person called your God. All right. So the true God has exalted Christ above Christ's partakers. Okay. So this word for companions, got a little too much here. Let's erase. Okay. All right. Your companions. This is a word for partakers, those who partake with you. Okay. Those are partakers. Okay. And this word for partakers, it gets translated as companions here, but it means partakers. It shows up in Hebrews, and every single time it refers to other human beings beyond your human partakers, which would indicate that the king is also a human being. Okay, let's get an example of how this is used. So in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 14, we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast. Okay, this word for partakers, same word that's used here in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9. Okay, again, you wouldn't see this in your English because it's not obvious to you. Okay, Jesus has been exalted above other human beings. We are partakers if we hold fast. All right. Again, to say that, why, if Jesus was Yahweh, why would you say that Yahweh has been exalted beyond human companions? Why would you say that? It doesn't make any sense. It makes much better sense if Jesus was a human being, just like the original Davidic king. All right. So here's something that's interesting in this passage, and we'll talk about this when we get to the applications, that Jesus is actually setting an example for the readers to follow. And I'm only saying this because the author of Hebrews is setting this up, and he's going to use it later when he gets to chapter 12. In chapter 12, verse 2, he's going to say, look to Jesus. He's the pioneer, and he's the perfecter of our faith. What did he do? For the sake of the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and he has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Okay? So Jesus loved righteousness and hated wickedness, resulting in God's exaltation. Here, Jesus is the pioneer and the perfecter, okay? He did what was right. He endured the cross, okay? He disregarded the shame, and therefore God highly exalted him to sit at his right hand, okay? So what Jesus did is not just something about his Christology. It's meant to be an example for us. We are to look to him. He is the pioneer and the perfecter of faith. And I think what this means is like faithfulness, as in Jesus was faithful to God. The book of Hebrews is going to have a lot to say about Jesus being faithful to God. Okay, so how does Hebrews chapter 1, verse 9 fit in the argument? Christ is greater than the angels because he was virtuous and because God exalted him above his human companions. Okay, we're already over the 1 hour point, so I'm going to quickly go through this last slide. Okay, takeaways. How does this apply to your life? How does this help you to be a better Christian? I thought there are 3 pretty self-evident application points. Number 1, Christ has shown that a life of obedience, even in the midst of suffering, does not go unnoticed by our Heavenly Father. Since Jesus is our example, the pioneer of faith, we too should love righteousness and hate wickedness. I think it's a pretty good application. He's our pioneer. He's the person we're supposed to follow. So if he loved righteousness and hated wickedness, and God exalted him because of that, then naturally we should do the same thing. We should love righteous behavior, the righteous new covenant stipulations, and wickedness we should not tolerate. In fact, we should hate it. Why? Because Jesus, our example, did it. And he's the example of faithfulness. Number 2, the human Messiah, Jesus, is worthy of worship. How? Is he worthy of worship as God? No. He's worthy of worship in his role as the promised Davidic king. And guess what? Angels are already worshiping him. So we should not show hesitancy to honor him as a worthy king. I know there's some Unitarians that think, well, I don't really know if we should be giving worship to Jesus. I think that's only worship that's due to God. The whole point here is that, the author of Hebrews has taken a passage from the Old Testament about angels worshiping and applied it to Jesus. Angels are worshiping him, which makes sense. If Jesus is in heaven right now, the angels are worshiping him. Okay. So if the angels are doing that, then he's certainly worthy of worship. And of course, naturally, that is something we should be imitating. If God is telling angels to worship Jesus, then we should also feel comfortable doing it as well. Again, we're worshiping him as the Messiah, as the Christ, as the Son of God. We're not worshiping him as the Creator. And then number three, since Christ is self-evidently greater than the heavenly angels that Yahweh formally spoke through, it is all the more vital that we listen to and heed carefully all that Jesus taught. If God is speaking through Jesus, then that's important. We need to listen to that. We need to commit to memory. We need to heed it, and we need to obey it. All right. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks for watching. If you stuck around this long, take care, and I will see you next time.